3 years ago, my boyfriend and I turned 30 and sold everything we owned, including my car, took his Trailblazer, and decided just to travel around the States and Canada. I guess you could call us backpackers, as we tend to chase good weather, find a state park, and backcountry hike into the wilderness for days at a time. My brother likes to joke that we're anti-establishment hippies. We don't necessarily live off the grid, but between the two of us, we have one prepaid phone we use for emergencies and checking in with family and friends, and one MacBook, which I use for work. I'm a freelance writer/content creator, and I'm on a retainer with a robotics company. I mostly write boring papers or web content. The whole point of our living situation is to live debt-free and have as few bills as possible. I only use free Wi-Fi, so 1 to 2 times a week, we have to go into the city and find a Starbucks. Last summer, we decided to go do some backcountry hiking in Arkansas. It's one of those states you don't ever really hear about other hikers visiting, but we've read that it has some beautiful natural landscape, and it does. The rules at this particular park were very lax. We didn't need a permit, and there were a few basic laws/guidelines, but there was no check-in needed. We had all the basics and planned to hike a 6-day hike, 3 days in and 3 days out. The whole time we were out there, we didn't see or hear another soul, but on one day, we were prepping to move off trail and find a camping spot as it was getting near dusk. Half a mile off the trail is usually the standard for us. We took what looked like a kind of an animal trail about a half a mile out, and we saw a green 2-person tent. It was almost camouflaged in the foliage, so we came on it almost by accident. Some backpackers prefer privacy, others are more social. We're the more social type. We've had some great experiences, camping near other backpackers, sharing stories, food, and a joint or two. We were around 30 yards away from the tent. It was zip closed, so my boyfriend shouted a greeting to make his presence known. No movement and no sound. We assumed the green tent guy either wasn't around or he didn't want to be bothered, so we started off in a new direction to get some distance between us. We camped and never heard a peep. We moved along the next morning, completely forgetting about the green tent guy, until nearing the end of day 5 on our trek back. We were again looking for a spot to camp off the trail when we came upon the green tent again. This isn't that unusual, but normally backcountry hikers keep moving, so we really weren't expecting it. The tent flap was open, so my boyfriend yells his greeting again, and nothing. My boyfriend wants to go check it out, saying it's weird and maybe someone is hurt. I didn't like the idea from the get-go, because even though we hadn't had any experiences personally, we heard enough stories from other backpackers about hermits and mountain men that want privacy and carry guns. But my boyfriend assured me that we would be fine, and if all else fails, offer him some weed to keep a peace, and we'd go on our separate ways. As soon as we get within 20 yards of the place, the smell of decomposition is intense. My boyfriend has been hailing his greeting over the last 20 yards, and once the smell hits him, he stops and turns to me and says, "What if we find a dead body?" My skin crawled. I was immediately afraid. I've never seen a dead body before and don't want to. The closer we get to the tent, the worse the smell got. I knew for sure we were going to walk in and see some old camper's rotting corpse. What we found was worse than that. Outside the tent was a dead doe's leg, all 4 of them covered in flies. It looked like the legs had been cut most of the way and then ripped off the rest of the way. It was a mess. Inside was the body and the head of the deer, but the middle portion was covered in a blue fleece blanket that was blood-soaked at the bottom where the legs used to be. It was laying on its side, bottom facing the tent entry. The tail had been cut off, and the butt of the deer was covered in dried blood, like something had been penetrating it. The same with its mouth. The bottom portion was bent down at a scary broken-looking angle. The tent was open, so we could see everything without having to go inside. Not that we would have anyway, because at this point, the smell was almost debilitating. There was a dirty, almost empty clear bottle of Jergens baby oil and a stained green fringed kitchen towel, and that was it. I immediately started crying and begging him to go. All I could muster up was, "What the hell was that?" And we turned and ran. We ran to the trail and jogged down it for as far as we could go until dusk was fully on us and we had to set up camp. We didn't go very far off the trail, and neither of us slept. We didn't start a fire or use headlamps after full dark. We just sat up and whispered to each other, going over and over what we had just seen. Every little noise startled us. It was like our brains were on red alert. I kept thinking at any moment a dead deer rapist would come back to his tent and see our footprints or something, know we were there, and track us back to our tent. I've never been so scared in my entire life. Just before dawn, we tore down and started out. My boyfriend stopped at the ranger station on our way out of the park and reported what we had just seen. The ranger was a young guy, around our age, and he looked as freaked out by our story as we were telling it. He wrote most of it down, and my boyfriend showed him a map approximately where it had been. He asked if we knew how the deer was killed, and at that point, we haven't even thought about it. We just assumed it had been shot, but because of the blanket, we didn't see a wound. But we weren't exactly giving it an autopsy either. We have since shortened our backcountry hikes to a maximum of 4 days. We have also been a lot less eager to call out to other campsites, and have never approached another unmanned tent again. This story takes place in August of 2013 in the mountains of southern Oregon. I'm a USAF, Security Forces Airman, a military policeman. My girlfriend was at work, and as a sweltering hot day began to turn into thunderstorms, me and my buddy Nick, another military cop, decided to go explore some back roads and get out of the heat of the town. Southern Oregon is crisscrossed with logging roads, some actively used, and many totally forgotten and grown over. Nick and I spent many of our days off, starting on the roads that we knew and finding roads that we didn't know, driving for hours in the mountains, eventually navigating back to the paved roads. On this particular day, with the storm clouds building over the mountains, we set off on a road we have never been on and began to drive into the mountains. After driving for about an hour, we hadn't seen nor heard any signs of other people in the woods. We rounded a bend in the thick woods and emerged in the meadow that was totally surrounded by thick aspen groves. The meadow was perfectly flat and eerily still. We both noticed the strange stillness almost immediately. No birds, hardly any insect noise, no squirrels, and certainly no other people. On the far side of the meadow, right at the edge of the tree line, there was a picnic table. The table was very odd. However, it was painted a bright orange color, and it was much larger than a typical picnic table in a park. Remarking on this, Nick drove through the meadow to get a closer look. I remember being apprehensive as we approached. The whole scenario was exceptionally strange. The overall silence of the aspen grove was unsettling. Also, it was almost nearly impossible to see far into the trees, as aspens grow extremely close together. We were parked by the table. I hopped out of the passenger seat of the truck to check it out. I'm not very tall, only about 5'5". Regardless, the table was ridiculously oversized and practically unusable. The seats were nearly at chest level, meaning I would have to climb up to even sit on them. As I was looking at the table, Nick called me over to the truck, and I noticed he was looking back into the aspens. At first, I couldn't see what he was looking at, but then I noticed a splash of color that was completely out of place in the thick trees. A small one-man tent was set back in the trees about 50 feet from the strange table. I had an initial feeling of dread and felt certain that there was someone in the tent, and if we could see the tent, they could see us. There were no campgrounds in the area, no people, no main roads for miles. Surely, someone camping so remotely would be at the very least a strange person. However, we observed the tent. We didn't see any movement or hear any sounds coming from it. Nick suggested that I called out, but I didn't want to, and I did. "Hey, is anyone there?" I yelled. No reply. Feeling completely on edge, Nick and I thought about driving away and leaving the strange area, but we began to fear the worst. What if there was a dead body in the tent? What if somebody had gotten kidnapped? Foolish, I know, but we thought it all the same. After some debate, we decided to have Nick turn the truck around to drive away from the camp. Should we need to leave in a hurry, he would be waiting behind the wheel. With my heart pounding, I started walking through the trees towards the tent. I was totally keyed up with my senses on full alert. When I reached the campsite, Several things struck me as odd. Backpacks were scattered all over. No fire had been built. No wood collected. The tent was literally full of backpacks and women's clothing. Full of dread, I turned to leave and tell Nick what I had seen. As I left, I heard Nick start yelling, "Let's go! Let's go! Let's get out of here!" Not knowing why he was yelling, I ran back to the truck. When I broke out of the trees, I saw a beat-up old Ford Taurus on the road, blocking us from leaving the meadow. I immediately leapt in the passenger seat, and Nick floored the gas pedal. The car was occupied by 2 men. A third person was lying against the window in the back. As we drove across the meadow, the driver attempted to block us from the road, but Nick drove around them and accelerated the way he had come from. I looked back and saw the car attempting to turn around on the narrow road. Nick drove like a madman, and I thought I was honestly terrified that they would catch up. We hit the highway without seeing the car again. I still do not know if the person in the back was male or female. I called the state police, and they promised to send a trooper out to check out the scene. However, I received a call the next day from a trooper stating that the campsite, the backpacks, and the woman's clothing was all gone, though he could tell me people had been in the area. The strange table was still by the thick aspen grove. I have not returned to that area, nor do I intend to. I'm a 13-year-old female. This happened when I was 9 years old, not that long ago, so I remember a lot. It may not be as scary as some of the other stories, but it scarred me due to the fact that it wasn't my first encounter with a pedophile, and I am left mentally scarred from my earlier childhood, where I was actually sexually assaulted. Anyway, back to the story. My grandpa at the time had a girlfriend who was emotionally abusive towards him, and he only broke up with her recently. Her name was Mindy. She also brought her 23-year-old daughter named Ava. My grandpa is a man who loves nature. He likes to go fishing, camping, and watches the Nature Channel documentaries. He decided to take me and his girlfriend and her daughter to upstate, where we could go to a campsite near a lake where we could go on the water and fish. The place was a big campground and had some small shops and some domestic animals. It also had a playground, and that's where the scary part takes place, but we'll get to that in a minute. We got there and set up camp. We were having fun until the 3rd day. My grandpa and Mindy got into a fight, and he decided to go pick me up some food for lunch and told Ava to watch me until he got back, since I didn't want to have to drive a half hour to McDonald's and then a half hour back. Ava agreed, and off he went. Mindy got wasted at this point, and Ava, knowing that Mindy would try to pull some crap, she took me to the playground. We had fun for about 45 minutes and decided to head back. Mindy had passed out when we got back, so we decided to relax. I had to go to the bathroom, so I told her I was going and that I wanted to go to the playground to see if kids were playing there. Mindy started to wake up, and Ava told me it was fine and told me she was going to take care of Mindy. I went off to the bathroom and saw that the kids had left, which I could tell because the bathroom was right next to the playground. All I saw was a man sitting on a bench, staring at nothing until he snapped back to his senses and noticed me. I felt a sense of uneasiness and went back to the outhouses that the place had. Due to my past experience with creepers in my earlier childhood, I knew he wasn't a nice guy. I got out of the bathroom and looked at the playground and noticed that the guy was gone. I had a feeling that he was watching me, but I still wanted to go to the swings now that the kids were gone. I located a rock to use as a weapon if he tried anything. I placed the rock under me on the swing and started swinging for about 5 minutes. I was about to leave when I noticed the man walk out from behind the bathroom. I remember a small opening at where the roof met on a point, but the wall wasn't connected where someone could look through, and that's where he was standing. I immediately realized that's probably what he was doing, and that's why I didn't see him. He quickly walked over to me, and I couldn't run away because he was coming from the direction of the opening to the playground, and behind me was a tall fence that led to the woods. I got off the swing and went to pick up my rock, but the man was right next to me at that point, and I felt that he would react badly to me threatening him with a rock, and there wouldn't be enough time for me to pick up the rock and hit him before he would try to grab me. At that moment, He leaned forward and asked me a question. Hey there, do you happen to be, French Canadian? This question confused me, and I told him yes. He then said in a low voice with a smile, I like French Canadian little girls. I didn't know what to do, but then a goat that belonged to the campground walked along the side of the path. This was the time of the day that they let the two goats walk around, and the playground was near the farm area. I saw it and gave a surprised look, and the man turned around and looked at it. You like goats? I picked up the rock, and he looked at me with a curious look and then smiled. I inched my way past him and ran back to the tent. I didn't tell anyone because I didn't want my grandpa to find out and go back to prison. He had gone to prison before for unrelated purposes, and I knew if he found the guy, he would have killed him. We left 3 days later, and I never saw him again. In November of last year, me and my friend decided to drive my car up to Scotland to do some fishing and eventually make our way to Edinburgh. After the first day of catching some salmon and brown trout, we stored our catches in a cooler box. After contemplating whether to sleep in the car tonight, as we had left it quite late to set up camp. Around 4:30ish, the sun was going down. Eventually, I said, let's set up a fire and cook the fish. I didn't drive all the way to Scotland to sleep in the car. My friend agreed, and we set off looking for a spot to camp. We found a little wooded area next to a car park near a farm. We looked into it prior, and apparently you can basically camp anywhere in Scotland as long as you left the place as you found it. So we grabbed all our stuff out of the car and started setting up our campsite. 20 minutes later, we have a fire going, 2 fold-up chairs and 2 tents up. My tent was out of view from my friends. This will be relevant later. We were glad we chose to camp instead of sleep in the car. As we smoked a few joints, we reminisced about school life. My friend struggled to keep his eyes open. As I checked my phone, 2 a.m., he called it a night, crawling into his tent and zipping it shut. I sat there with my feet up on my friend's now empty seat, listening to the sounds of wildlife. I shut off the torch we had hung up on a tree next to us, leaving me in the darkness apart from the burning embers from the coal. It must have been 3 or so minutes before I started to hear the crunching of the leaves, snapping of twigs that seemed to be coming towards me. Being a quite rational person, I passed it off as a fox, drawn to the scraps of food that we may have left lying around. I was quickly proven wrong when I heard a sniffle, like someone with a cold clearing their nose. My high quickly turned from chilled out to paranoia as I feel a heavy dread coming over me. My mind raced. Why would someone be out in the woods at 3 a.m.? Why are they coming toward me? I slowly reached down in my pocket and felt my heart drop as I didn't feel my smooth blade of my pocket knife. Shit, I must have left it in the tent. All the while, I hear the treading coming closer and closer, and my heart was racing. Out of the darkness, I see a middle-aged man who was clean-shaven and had parted hair, around 5'10", slowly creeping toward me, almost on all fours like a predator, trying to stay out of sight. I sat there paralyzed, unable to speak. My mouth was dry, and I could hardly swallow. That's when I realized he hadn't even seen me. Being under a tree with no light source, I must have blended in. Also, with there only being one tent in view, I guess he thought my friend was the only one camping here. He got closer to the tent and half breathed and half whispered, "Come on, do it," in a raspy voice. Creeped the hell out and unable to bear the thought of what he'd do next, I said, "Oh, can I help you?" He jumped up in shock, and his whole demeanor changed. He looked at me, mumbling awkwardly as he scurried back out of the woods. I sat there, still trying to comprehend what had happened, when I saw the headlights of a car turn on and drive away. I woke my friend, and he could tell how shook up I was without a full explanation from me. He willingly grabbed all of our gear, and we slept in the car that night with all the doors locked.